You better watch out.
Nope, you can't do that because we don't have the rights.
Oh, right. I don't have the rights to this copyrighted music. But this is what we decided to call our Christmas podcast, brought to you by Nothing or Triple, a podcast about Christmas movies and everything we love and not love so much.
Okay, so welcome back if you've been listening, and welcome if this is your first time. Episode 3 of the podcast is called An Unfulfilled Wish, The Biggest Christmas Disappointments. So Ian and I were thinking about movies that on paper sound like they are guaranteed Christmas classics. They have the right elements, the right cast, the right producers and directors and budget and everything, and it seems like it's going to be a really surefire hit. And then you watch the movie and you have this growing sense of dread, and by the end you think, what the hell was that?
Yeah, there's nothing worse than a cinema disappointment when you have high expectations. You think either the filmmakers or the cast or the story are all aligned, and you've been let down. This is worse than a movie that you had no expectations or little expectations because you've already decided that it was probably going to be a good movie, and your expectations were poorly managed, and now you're disappointed.
Yeah, although we should blame the studios for messing this up for us.
Yeah, they have enough money to know better.
Yeah, seriously. Okay, so let's dive in. We each made a list of movies we want to talk about. Why don't you go first, because I think you have more movies than I do on this list.
Okay. All right, so I think I'm going to start with 2 because I'm going to blaze through one real quickly. Because in the last episode, I talked about how I didn't like Scrooged, and I don't want to dig too deep into why that movie disappointed me, but it was just a disappointment for the same reasons I said in the last episode, because I was a huge Bill Murray fan, and I like old 80s movies with Bill Murray, and that one I had such high expectations only because I hadn't seen it until recently, and so my expectations were, just for a completely different movie, and it just...
Yes, this is a horrible opinion. Move on.
Anyway, yeah, so that is what it is. Okay, so in my number 5 spot, I've got Home Alone 3. Now, for the most obvious reasons, why would you bother making a Home Alone movie without Macaulay Culkin or any of his family members? Just on paper, it's a bad idea. But I took the time to actually watch this movie when it came out, and it was more disappointing than it is on paper. You look at the poster or the box on the shelf at Blockbuster Video, and you see this movie with Home Alone 3, you can't help but get excited. And you're like, who's that kid? I don't know about this. I'm going into it. And it was a massive letdown.
I think I remember the kid's name, and I'm pretty sure it was Alex D. Linz. And I think it was funny because his middle initial was like on all the posters and the home video box and stuff. I don't remember if I actually saw the movie. I probably didn't, but for some reason that stuck with me.
You're right. It's Alex D. Linz.
Alex D. Linz. Has he done anything else recently?
Well, he still has a kid picture as his... Okay. So probably not.
Yeah.
No, all of his movies are from the 90s. Yeah. Directed by Raja Gosnell.
Oh, I know him. He did a live-action Scooby-Doo movie that was actually pretty good. And it had a really great song from Outkast called Land of a Million Drums. Sorry. Okay, let's go.
Yeah, and it should have been good. I mean, it was written by John Hughes, but still the movie was a disappointment. It tried to capitalize on classic tropes that we love from the first 2 Home Alones and just failed because it felt like a copycat. It felt like a total ripoff, and it didn't work out. Yeah. So I was very disappointed. All right, what's your...
Okay, so I guess these are ranked from least worst to... No, sorry, least biggest disappointment to biggest disappointment. So number 5, Bad Santa 2. And actually, I enjoyed this movie enough. It's always fun to see Billy Bob Thornton, and especially in this role, he's hilarious. But it's the sort of movie that simply could not live up to the original. And the Coen brothers didn't have anything to do with this one. So, they advised the script on, or maybe did rewrites on the script for the first one. And it was a new director this time. So originally the first director, Terry Zwigoff, was going to do the sequel, and I don't remember what happened. It fell through, and it was kind of a surprise that this movie got made at all. And another big bummer is that John Ritter and Bernie Mac were not in this movie. Bernie Mac for obvious reasons if you've seen the first, and John Ritter because he died young, unfortunately.
Right.
But anyway, it just wasn't. It was okay. I really wanted it to be great like the first one. It wasn't.
I have little to contribute to the Bad Santa feels, only because I haven't seen the first or second.
Oh, gosh.
And so while I have huge ambition someday to have commentary on movies that I'm late to seeing, but better late than never, I'll save that for next year if we manage to record this again next year.
Yeah. Okay, go. Next.
All right. In the number 4 spot, the 2009 animated A Christmas Carol by Robert Zemeckis was a huge disappointment to me because I'm a huge fan of the original Dickens tale and many of its renditions and adaptations. But this one had a combination of Jim Carrey not exactly on his game. He's overacting in beyond the typical Jim Carrey fashion. The character didn't seem genuine. It seemed fake. It seemed like a caricature of Scrooge and not a character. So I love Jim Carrey and I love A Christmas Carol. In fact, one of my favorite all-time Christmas movies may or may not be one of the Christmas carols, but that just leads to my disappointment in this. Plus the hyper-realistic animated style that Zemeckis has done on a few films. You've got Beowulf and Polar Express and now this. And I'm not personally a fan of that style. I think it holds back the narrative because it's very distracting. Mm-hmm. The Uncanny Valley is part of that.
Tell people what the Uncanny Valley is.
Okay, so for those that don't know, the Uncanny Valley is when special effects are used to produce something that is meant to look realistic but doesn't quite land. And you know this anytime that you've seen a special effect that just didn't look very realistic. If you didn't notice, then it wasn't in the Uncanny Valley. They successfully pulled it off to the point that you couldn't distinguish it. Or it's done in an animation style where it's not meant to be real. These are your animated films like Pixar or anything Pixar makes, or Arthur's Christmas, for example, where it's obviously an animated film. You're not expecting it to look super realistic.
I'll elaborate a little bit and say that something exists in the Uncanny Valley if it's intended to be received as human, and it's not. So the Uncanny Valley, you know, the problems they run into with animation frequently are in facial expressions and in particular the eyes. The eyes seem to be the hardest thing to replicate.
Right.
So yeah, okay.
But all in all, it just felt like a movie that was trying very hard, but ultimately lost its soul along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a period where Robert Zemeckis was really interested in the technology. He was sort of in a James Cameron moment where he wanted to push the industry forward. So yeah, he did the 3 movies: Beowulf, Polar Express, and A Christmas Carol. And oddly enough, I think Beowulf was the first one, and I think it was the best. Maybe because there's a fantasy element to it that sort of allows you to suspend disbelief. But okay, and we'll talk about Polar Express later. But my next one is Office Christmas Party. So I actually love R-rated, irreverent Christmas movies if they have the right elements in them. And you know, as an adult, the Office Christmas Party is something that most people are familiar with. You've been to an Office Christmas Party. They generally aren't great, but sometimes they're fun, and they sort of seem like a staple for the season. So the cast for this movie is absurd. It's Jason Bateman, Olivia Munn, T.J. Miller, Jennifer Aniston, Kate McKinnon, Courtney B. Vance, who was in a great movie that I'm not sure is on any of our lists called The Bishop's Wife, Jillian Bell, Rob Corddry, Randall Park, Sam Richardson, who's hilarious on Veep, Karen Sony from Deadpool. Who else am I forgetting here? Matt Walsh, who's also on Veep. Ben Falcone. Anyway, it had an absolutely fantastic cast and a pretty funny premise, which I don't remember it exactly, but Jennifer Aniston was sort of the tight
mistletoe
CEO, and the rest of the staff really wanted to have a party. So her brother throws the party, and something goes wrong, and they have to leave the office to make it go right. And it's just, you know, kind of like a series of hijinks. But it wasn't funny. It had an incredible amount of talent, and it just wasn't funny, and it was kind of nasty. And I watched it once and have no interest in seeing it again. So to me, that's a huge disappointment because it could have been really funny.
Yeah, that's another one that I missed.
Yeah,
but
keep missing it.
I'll keep on missing that movie. All right, cool. So in my number 3 spot is the 2000 How the Grinch Stole Christmas by Ron Howard. I'm a huge fan of the book. I'm a fan of the animated movie, but more so for its somewhat cameo role in Home Alone than the movie itself. Obviously, the music's very good. I wanted this movie to be amazing. This movie came out in 2000 when it seemed like Jim Carrey could do anything. And the movie is great in some ways, and I do like this movie, but ultimately I left this movie disappointed. And I watch it with my kids every year, so it's not a total failure, but I was disappointed in that Ron Howard opted to do it as a live-action film. I think that Jim Carrey is on his game in this film and does a very good job, as well as the rest of the cast. But it got super weird because he decided not only to do it as a live-action film, but because he decided to depict the Who's as anatomically accurate to Dr. Seuss's illustration as he could in live action. And so in the same way that Zemeckis had this uncanny valley with his hyper-realistic animated films, you have that, but it's not the uncanny valley. These aren't CGI graphics. These are makeup prosthesis and
it's the Canny Valley.
Well, it's just weird is what it is. I mean, you have these people with these like, what is it called on an animal when their palate is split? They have like snouts. They look like animals. Yeah. And it's super distracting, and it makes it harder to relate to those characters. There's some clever writing in there. There's some jokes. A lot of the actors are really on point with some of the comedy. The story is a little overfluffed in some place because it's a short book and they had to extend it to make a feature film. But for the most part, it works on paper. But my issue with this film, my disappointment, are purely in the aesthetics. And I think had they made it an animated film, had it been done, and maybe the technology wasn't quite right in 2000. Pixar had only been around making successful movies for about 5 years at that point. But I think that it should have either had been animated or waited a little bit until the animation could have been better. But visually, I just found it so distracting.
I've never seen The Grinch. I have actively avoided the live-action version. Every year when I'm trying to find new Christmas movies to watch, I watch crappy Hallmark movies instead of watching The Grinch because it just doesn't seem like the kind of movie I would like. So maybe I'll give it a shot. But I have an observation to make.
What's that?
You have 2 Jim Carrey movies on your list, and you have 2 Christmas Carol adaptations on your list.
On this one?
Yeah.
The reason for those are the same reason.
You don't like Charles Dickens and you don't like Jim Carrey.
No, it's the exact opposite. I love Dickens and I love Jim Carrey, which means my expectations are so high.
Yeah.
Because my expectations are so high, when the output is delivered, then I'm more easily disappointed or frustrated because it doesn't meet that standard.
All right, that makes sense, except for the fact that you're wrong about Scrooged. But my next one, what number am I on here? 5, 4, 3, is a movie that just came out this year on Netflix called The Christmas Chronicles, starring the great Kurt Russell, who honestly is one of my all-time favorite actors. I grew up watching him in the 60s Disney movies like The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes, and I love all of his John Carpenter movies. He's like seriously one of my all-time favorite movies. Actors. So when Netflix announced that he was going to be playing Santa Claus, I thought perfect. It came at a moment when Netflix was spending a ton of money on their movies. So this movie probably had like a healthy $60 to $80 million budget. The premise is about 2 siblings who try to get proof of Santa Claus and end up on an adventure with him. All the right elements are there. It takes place in Chicago, which, if you heard our first episode, is one of the places I think of when I think of Christmas movies. But I think the big problem here is the script is just a disjointed mess. There are pieces of other types of Christmas movies. There's the family drama because you find out in the opening sequence that the father has died and the son feels like he has to live up to his dad's expectations. So that there's family drama. There's Santa Claus getting separated from his magic, so that's an element. There's a bizarre musical element to it with a great cameo from Steve Van Zandt from the E Street Band, and so that I was like, yes, Steve Van Zandt, little Stevie, and then the scene was kind of weird and didn't fit together. You have a scene in a park in Chicago where one of the main characters